Do you ever feel like you're a bad teacher because your students are misbehaving? In this episode, we're going to dive into why bad behavior from your students does not mean you're a bad teacher. Here we go. Welcome back to the Teach for the Heart podcast, where we tackle teaching challenges from a biblical perspective. Why are we here? Because we don't believe that our spiritual walk and teaching profession should exist in two separate domains. Rather, the hope we have in Christ should change how we approach everything, not just at home, but at school as well. So join us as we explore both the spiritual and practical sides of key teaching challenges, integrating them together so we can succeed at teaching, glorify God, and make a lasting difference in our students' hearts and lives. This episode is brought to you in partnership with the Herzog Foundation. And today I'm so excited to be talking to you about this topic: why bad behavior does not necessarily mean that you are a bad teacher. And I have so much to share about this because there are dangers on all sides of this question. But what I want to basically address with you is this feeling of frustration, discouragement, in some cases, even like a lack of self-worth that we can get when we see our students misbehaving. And maybe we've worked with them forever on this issue and they're still misbehaving, or maybe you have a kid that gets up in your middle of class and something drastic happens. There's a fight, there's swearing, there's, really disrespect or just a really blow up situation. And you're just like, oh my goodness, I am a failure as a teacher because this happened in my class. So I want to make an argument today for why bad behavior does not necessarily mean you're a bad teacher. But on the other side, I also want to talk about, though, what we are supposed to do. So what I want to help us do is kind of differentiate in our mind, what are we responsible for? What are we not responsible for? And if you're feeling nervous a little bit right now about this, stick with me. Let's talk about it together. So the first thing I want to talk about is how we often tend to tie our identity to how good of a job we're doing. And if you don't, that's fantastic. But I know I can easily fall into this. A lot of people I talk to, and I think especially a lot of us teachers, like, we are people that like to do a great job. And sometimes we can tie our identity up in that, right? And as Christians, we know our identity can't be rooted in anything other than Christ. Otherwise, we are setting ourselves up for a lot of frustration, a lot of stress, a lot of worry, none of which is necessary, because who we are is settled because of what God says about us, because of his love and his care for us. He doesn't need us to be an amazing teacher, right? In order for him to love us. So a lot of times we can tie our identity into how good of a job we're doing. And then we can tie how good of a job we're doing into our students' behavior, right? If our students are behaving poorly, we assume I'm a bad teacher. And we can get really, really discouraged really, really quickly. And that discouragement can keep us, in some cases, from coming to our job, coming to our calling and our ministry with the passion and the zeal and the excitement that we are serving God, right? So that frustration can get in the way, can make us less effective. So this is really one of my main goals here, is to target that discouragement piece, but to also help us know what we do need to be doing. So here's the thing. There are two dangers when it comes to this. When we come to thinking, okay, bad behavior, does that mean I'm a good or bad teacher? There are two dangers. And this is true in many cases where I'm sure you've heard the analogy of someone like walking around a road and there's a ditch on this side and there's a ditch on that side. And sometimes we normally tend to recognize one ditch or the other. We see one ditch and say, I don't want to go in that ditch. But what can happen is if we see one ditch, we can sometimes go just, run all the way on from the other side of the road and land in the other ditch. And we don't want to land in either one. So we're going to explore both sides of the ditch. Now, first of all, I want to talk about the no responsibility ditch. The no responsibility ditch says, this isn't my fault. I have no responsibility for my students' behavior in this particular example that we're talking about today. It is not my fault. I am not responsible for my students' behavior. I can't fix it. There's nothing I can do. These kids are just crazy. Okay. That is a danger and that is a ditch. Okay. And that is very problematic. So if we assume there is nothing we can do in our classroom to fix the student behavior, and we just say, well, it just is what it is, that is not what I am advocating here for today at all. There is a lot that we can do. There is a lot that we are responsible to do. So I want to say right off the bat here, that is a danger. That would be abdicating our God-given authority. If we just let students run crazy and we're just like kind of a hands-off approach, like, there's nothing I can do. It's not my responsibility. Or maybe it's like, I know it's kind of my job, but I can't. It's too crazy. We can't have that hands-off approach. We cannot abdicate our God-given responsibility and our God-given authority in the classroom. So that is a ditch we absolutely want to avoid. But on the other side of the road is another ditch. And that is the ditch of taking on too much responsibility. So too little responsibility, not good. Too much responsibility is also not good. And what I mean by this is we can assume responsibility or guilt for things that we can't control. Okay. And the reality is, I cannot control my students' choices, okay? And we're going to talk about this in a minute. I can and I must set up environments and rules and expectations and discipline that encourage good choices, that limit bad behavior. But the bottom line is I cannot control what someone else chooses to do. If a student chooses to stand up in my classroom and spew out who knows what, I cannot control that my student chose to do that. I can control my response to that and how I handle it and what I do to prevent it from happening in the future. Okay. But I cannot control that happened. And that is where I really want to distinguish. Okay. Is that we cannot control what our students choose to do in any one given moment. And so if one thing happens and we are taking that on ourselves in a way that says like, I'm a failure because that happened. I'm a bad teacher because this incident occurred. I'm not, I feel so discouraged because I've been working and working and working with these students and they're still not getting it. Okay. We are not responsible for the student's response. We are responsible for what we do. So that is the key. And I'm going to kind of get into this here in a little bit, but in the danger of no responsibility, we are abdicating our authority. We're not controlling what we can control. In the ditch, in the danger of too much responsibility, we are trying to control things that we can't control. And we're taking on discouragement and stress over other people's behavior, which we actually can't control. So what does the road look like right in the middle where we're not in either ditch? What does God call us to as teachers? And I believe what God calls us to is to do everything we can to create a classroom environment where students are learning and growing and where there aren't a lot of behavior issues and kind of what I mentioned before, responding correctly when situations happen and being strategic about preventing problems. That is what we can control. And I will say, if you're not doing that, then I'm not here to answer the question, are you a bad teacher? I wouldn't say let's not even go there. But that is the place where, okay, there's some room for growth here. Okay. If I'm not doing that, if I'm not responding well, if I'm not being really proactive in preventing issues, then I do have room to improve. I need to work on that. Okay. That is within my realm of responsibility. But what any given student chooses to do on any given day, that is not my responsibility. Okay. I'm responsible for how I respond, what procedures I put in place, how I adapt, but I cannot take on that guilt for what a student chooses to do. I hope that this distinction is starting to make a little bit of sense, because I do think it is really key to our ability to stay encouraged, to not get discouraged, and also to point our energy in the right spot, right? We want to point our energy towards, what can I do differently? What should I change? And not let our energy get just frustrated and sucked out of us because of what students are doing, which that changing of the hearts, that is God's responsibility to work in that student's life, right? It's our responsibility to allow God to work in our life and our choices that we're making. Okay, so what exactly am I saying that we should do? I have two main things that we need to do. Number one, we need to focus on what we are called to do and trust God with the rest. Okay. I'm wearing my chosen t-shirt today, actually. And this is a little bit of a coincidence, but I was like, oh, I gotta wear it to record this podcast because I want to quote the creator of The Chosen, Dallas Jenkins. He says this all the time, and I'll explain how it relates. He says, this is something that God taught him, that it's not your job to feed the 5,000. It's only to bring your loaves and your fish. And if you're not familiar, this lesson that God taught him comes from the Bible, the feeding of the 5,000, and the idea that the little boy brought the loaves and the fish to God. He gave him what he had. But he could never multiply and produce the results. Only God could do that. And I think that this is a really helpful phrase and a really helpful lesson for us to think about. And that is, we are absolutely called to do our part, to teach with excellence, to do what we can. So in other words, it would be, once again, the ditch to just sit back and go, okay, God, you fix my classroom. I'm not gonna, hold anybody accountable. I'm not gonna have any expectations and procedures, but just please make my kids behave. Okay. We're not doing what God has called us to do in that case. We're not bringing our loaves and our fish to him to multiply. Okay. But at the same time, when we do what we can in our classroom, we bring our loaves and our fish to him, and say, God, I'm doing everything I can. Okay. You got to make this work. Right. At that point, we have to trust him with the results. And sometimes those results that God brings into our life include difficult students, include challenging situations. He might be teaching us a lot through them. We shouldn't just expect that all of the discipline issues, all of the challenges will just poof, be gone. Okay. God is working in your students. God is working in you. And often what he calls us to do is challenging. Okay. So we shouldn't expect it to just be easy, but we can trust. The point is, we can trust God with the results. It's not our job to, like I said, feed the 5,000, right? It's just our job to do our part. So what exactly does that look like? What does our part look like, and what is God's part? Well, I think our part is creating that right environment in our room. So here are some of the things I believe that we are called to do in our classroom, specifically related to behavior. We are called to create clear expectations of what is and isn't acceptable for our students. We are called to have good procedures in our classroom that minimize disruptions and help things run smoothly. We are called to discipline, meaning that we are called to respond to each situation. So when a discipline error occurs, we are called to respond to that, to handle it in a way that is wise and good and is going to help. We are called to be strategic in preventing problems. We are called to analyze what's going on in our classroom and ask ourselves, or ask a mentor, what can I do to keep this from happening regularly? We are responsible to create an environment that helps students learn and encourages right choices. Okay. There's a difference between, something, like I said, something happens. We can't control what a student does. But if we don't look at that and say, okay, if we notice something is happening regularly, man, we have a lot of students having trouble with X, lying, stealing, disrupting, blurting out. And if we just say, oh, I can't control any of this, no, we need to be asking, okay, what's going on? Is there an underlying issue here? How can I address this? How can I teach my students this character trait or this area of self-control? Okay, so we are absolutely responsible for making all those questions. We need to respond well when students misbehave. We need to encourage them when they do right things. We need to hold our students accountable. We need to be patient with our students. We need to love them. All those things are our responsibility. Those are our loaves and fish that we bring day in and day out. What are we not responsible for? What is the feeding of the 5,000? Well, that's how our students respond, the choices that they make. So if you're working with a really, really difficult student and you're working with them and you are being consistent and you are loving them and you are doing all the things, just keep at it. Keep bringing those loaves, keep bringing those fish. It's up to God to make that grow in their heart. It's God, only God can change their heart. It might happen today. It might happen 2 months from now. It might happen 2 years from now. We can't control that. So don't, I guess my point here is, don't worry so much about how students respond and the results. You focus on what God has called you to do in the classroom. So yes, bottom line, we cannot control what our students do, but we can and must control what we do to help them learn, to help them grow, and to encourage right choices. So to kind of drive this home, I just want to give a few examples of how we might think and respond. Okay, so let's say and we talk about doing classroom shakeups in Classroom Management 101. We teach how to do that. Say you do a classroom shakeup, you really work with your students in this area, you teach them, how to do this, how to walk into the classroom, and let's say the next day, you worked with them on not running into the classroom, and the next day students are still running into the classroom after you just shook it up and taught this yesterday. So the wrong response would be, ugh, they will never get this. What's the point? I give up. Okay, that is I'm taking on too much, right? What is the right response? A right response would be, okay, what can I control? All right, every time they run into the classroom, I'm going to ask them to go back in and walk in calmly. I'm going to stick with that, and it will get easier with time, and I'm going to trust God to work in my students' hearts. Okay, so do you see how I'm focusing on, okay, I'm going to be consistent. I'm not going to give up on this just because it didn't work first time through. I'm going to keep being consistent. I'm not going to get discouraged. Here's another example. A student screams at another student in the middle of class. So the taking on too much responsibility says, I'm such a bad teacher. How could I let this happen in my class? But the right response says, okay, I'm not responsible for what my students choose to do. Excuse me. But I am responsible for how I respond. I need to respond calmly according to my plan. Okay. So focusing on what you can control and then trusting God and not worrying and not letting your worth be dependent on what you can't control. And by the way, I just mentioned responding according to your plan. If you do not have a classroom management plan that clarifies your expectation, that helps you know how to encourage your students, what consequences you're going to use, and has, this is the key part, a pre-planned response to all of the common issues that you face, that tool is going to be so incredibly helpful for you to know I'm responding correctly. I am doing my part. So if you don't have that, I really want to encourage you. We have a free training. It's like 28 minutes. So it's like the length of a podcast episode that will help walk you through what this looks like. And you can get it at teachfortheheart.com/free. So teachfortheheart.com/free. All right. So I said, what should we do here? Number one, we need to focus on what we can do and then trust God with what we cannot control. And then number two, it's so important, kind of going to end where we started, not to tie our worth to anything other than God and Jesus Christ. We've talked a lot here about how we shouldn't define how good of a teacher we are is not defined by students' behavior because we can't control that. We can only control what we can do, right? But to take that one step farther, not only is how good of a teacher we are not defined by students' behavior, but our self-worth is not defined by how good of a teacher we are. And we can so often conflate the two, right? We find our worth in, do I feel like I'm a good teacher today? And the reality is, our worth is fixed in Christ. He made you. He loved you so much that he sent Jesus. God the Father sent Jesus to die for you. If you have accepted that and you are in Christ, he sees you as perfectly righteous because you are wearing Jesus' robes of righteousness. You are his child, his loved one. You have an eternity that is secure in heaven. We need to remind ourselves of these things and remind ourselves that God has called me to this task. He will equip and enable me, but I'm secure in him whether I have a good day or a bad day, whether I have a challenging group of students or students I love to work with. That doesn't affect who I am. My worth is fixed in him. And when I'm confident in that, that enables me to come to my job and my work and my ministry day in and day out with confidence, with passion, and without getting discouraged as easily. So I hope that these thoughts have been helpful for you. I hope you'll continue to mull them over, or maybe talk about it with a fellow teacher, send them this episode to listen to, and then discuss it. Because there's a lot here to unpack and a lot more than I had time to talk with you today. But I hope this is a helpful starting point for that conversation. And then once again, I encourage you to check out our free training, How to Reduce Disruption So You Can Actually Teach. It's at teachfortheheart.com/free. And if you say, Linda, I want some step-by-step help, I want help making my plan, I really could use that. We love helping teachers do that in our Classroom Management 101 program. You can always get more info about that at teachfortheheart.com/CM101 for Classroom Management 101. Well, thank you guys so much for being here. It was a pleasure to speak with you. This episode has been brought to you in partnership with the Herzog Foundation. All views and opinions are our own and do not necessarily reflect those of the Herzog Foundation. If you love this episode, please do share with a friend, talk about it, discuss it, and then we'd love for you to leave a review of this podcast. That is a really helpful way for us to spread the word to more teachers. Thank you so much for being here. I look forward to speaking with you again soon. In the meantime, teacher, remember, God is at work in you and through you, and He's using you to make a difference. Keep your eyes on Him and teach for the heart.